All right, welcome back, everyone. I have a special guest with me tonight, author and amazing researcher of ancient history and philosophy, Mathieu LaCroix. How are you tonight, Mathieu?
Great. It's awesome to be here with you, Chris.
Great, great. How are things out there?
Well, spring is finally arriving in Maine. Our big snowpack is starting to open up holes where the sun is getting to it, and slowly but surely the spring birds are moving in, and I'm excited for our first 60-degree day.
Great, sounds great. Well, let's get into this. Let's tell me a little bit about your background and what got you started down this path. Yes, let's get started with that.
Well, I'm a big outdoors guy. I hike a lot. I wasn't even really much into writing when I was younger. I mean, I did a little bit of dabbling here and there, but I was more someone who was trying to seek something that maybe I wasn't really aware of. I was spending a lot of time, not only just in the outdoors, but even pretty much as far into the wilds as I could. And now, in retrospect, looking back on it, I think one of the major reasons I did that was, and I actually used to talk about it with some of the people I was with, was I just really rejected a lot of the model of what society had turned into, with people wanting to spend their time either going to sporting events or going to the mall or all these things, and I couldn't stand it. It was something that really was causing me almost to feel lost. And so every several times a week, I would take off from high school or college or whatever and just hike in the mountains. I went to Plymouth State University, so I was just south of the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and I got to have my fill of going up there sometimes every other day. And for me, spending time out there and reconnecting with what I realized was the real reality, the balance of everything and where in harmony of where it should be, and the quiet, so that the quiet allowing higher consciousness to be able to be very easily obtained. And then when I came back after spending sometimes days camping or whatever it was, it would really be very apparent to me the differences of being all of a sudden surrounded by wireless signals and blaring radios and TVs and all these things. And it was very quickly that I started to realize that there was these two worlds that were clashing together. There was, this one world that we've created where we're all distracted and doing all these interesting things. In some cases, people are just almost running between structures and ignoring the outdoors entirely. And not even that, but in most places where we have bright city lights, which is pretty common in a lot of urban areas, people can't even see the stars. So if you don't have any of the outdoors around you, and you can't see the stars anywhere, it's very easy to cause yourself to become lost in a system that is created for that very purpose. Just because of the fact that we have the potential to do a lot of very amazing things with our mind and waking up our consciousness and our chakras. And there's a lot of danger and threat against people fundamentally seeing reality in a completely different way. So when I was spending a lot of time out there and having all these experiences, I started to do some writing about it and reflecting back on what it did for me and how I saw things. And very quickly, when I was at the same time studying ancient history and about consciousness, it really became clear to me that we don't understand our ancient history, and more importantly, it's deliberately been held back so we don't know the truth of a lot of the events that have happened over thousands of years. And more importantly, the book that I ended up writing after that stretch of realizing all of this, I wrote a book called The Illusion of Us: The Suppression and Evolution of Human Consciousness, because it became apparent that consciousness and seeking the higher side of ourselves was pretty much the lowest priority of, you could call it, our educational systems and our system as a whole. And so I wanted to figure out, well, what is real? Who are we? What makes up our identity? Is it our physical body, or is it this much more important side of our consciousness? And that's what led me down to realizing that consciousness and understanding our dimensional selves is something that we really have been held back from. And you really see that if you think about how we have a curriculum, especially in places like the United States, where consciousness and delving into these deeper sides they're not even taught, and nobody even really discusses them. It's like a really taboo subject still, because we are in many ways kept in this illusion of both our physical body and that the physical reality around us is all that exists, and that keeps us in this perpetual loop, I think.
Definitely. So you would definitely say, I mean, our entire history is basically a lie, and most of what we read in history books is false. That pretty accurate?
Yeah, it's not like we would say every single thing is a creation of a false reality. It's just that it's been manipulated in such a way where it's been written by the victors to give a predetermined outlook for what the history was. And I think by far the best example of that, and this is one of the biggest conscious shifts. I just had a great discussion with someone last weekend. This is one of the biggest conscious shifts that is occurring right now. Of course, not on the level that maybe you and I would want, because a lot of people are the levels of consciousness in the group that's going to listen to this, and people that we associate it with, we tend to have a little bit of a higher conscious level. It's just simply awareness. And so some people, even people that aren't really conscious and aware, they're still responding to some of these altered history examples. And let me give you that example, and that would be Columbus Day. Because right now, I've seen only in the last couple of years, you could call it the general population, this collective consciousness we have, has started to really push for Columbus Day to be completely changed to Indigenous or Native American Day, or whatever they want to call it. And that's amazing, because that's a complete opposite, if you think about it, of what we were celebrating before. And that basically reflects the idea that we used to see Columbus as a hero, just like all these other characters that we have gone down in our history. When out, they're actually the villain. They're actually the one who's the bad guy, I guess you could call it. And that's why we're changing to realize that if you look at what Columbus really did, it's being sent over from the eagle of the Catholic Church, and then Cortez going to Mexico, and then Pizarro conquering South America. You saw there's this systematic conquering of the north to the south of the Americas. And that was where some of the most preserved legacy of these ancient cultures that went back thousands of years existed, and they were essentially all wiped out. And the reason why that's so important is that we celebrated, Columbus came over here. They were all just these very primitive people who were, they weren't technologically advanced at all. They were just basically like animals in their mind. And Columbus came over and brought all these, these people that we deem appropriate and, like us, and they colonized and took over and became the land of America. When in reality, if you look at it objectively, how those events were viewed and how they actually happened, it was really just basically an army of soldiers that had this basically they were sent to find this this land of America, whatever, and then basically take it over. And now the really interesting about that though is that we're told that Columbus was being sent west because he wanted to expand the spice trade route. But if you look, he came west into the Bahamas and down through Puerto Rico and Cuba. And he never went west. He never went further west than there. In fact, he came multiple times back to those same locations, because when they came there, they found the natives wearing gold on their with necklaces and various different metals and things. He took them as slaves, and he demanded and forced them to tell him where they got that gold from. And then they spent the next several years mining and using the local people as slaves in Cuba and Puerto Rico, and hundreds of thousands died. Hundreds of thousands of people died, and it's something that people don't even know about in history, because our history has been so rewritten by the victors that we have this complete false view of what actually happened. So if you look at that on the surface, we're told Columbus is supposed to go west for a spice trade route, but he keeps going to Puerto Rico and Cuba and mining gold and then bringing it back to Spain. It really doesn't sound like they were trying to find a western route. He never even landed in Mexico. And so the whole thing, you realize that the motivation and the reason behind the reason they really went there was to both find these resources of the Americas and get them, and also conquer these people, because the church knew that there was a threat with a lot of the information that was contained in the Americas, and there was a lot of really, really important information that had been connected back to a lot of these important places that we can get into. But so that's an example. So right now, the people of the Americas are starting to realize that here, this soldier from the church came over and was part of taking over and stealing all the land. And eventually, through war and all the terrible means that occurred, they were able to eradicate and take over and completely take this land of America and turn it into what it is today. And what is it? Well, we have people fighting over, saying that certain cultures and certain ethnicities don't belong here, and yet we're all people that traveled here. It doesn't make any sense. It's so silly if you think about it. And the population of Native Americans that still exists in the United States is less than 5%. It's less. I think it's less than 1%. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction, and that's really very disturbing to think about. It's essentially a genocide of the Native people, and that, to me, people are starting to realize that, and they're changing their model of viewpoint to start celebrating the Native people rather than this conquering supposed hero.
Yes, you see that. And I see a lot of people are waking up to a lot of the things that are going on nowadays. And thank you for that. That's some amazing information. Really appreciate that. So anything I say, I really hope that people are objective and they go look yourself, because that's when truth really becomes real for the individual, when they actually can go verify information. I've done a lot of study and research, because I don't want to say something that's maybe not real, or something that some people might think is a creation of one person. I try to only focus myself as being objective based to find the truth. Right. Yes. And yeah, always do your own research. Definitely. Yeah. So going back in our history, I'm fascinated with the ancient mythos, whether it be Egyptian or Sumerian. I'm just now learning all about it. Going back to the beginning, can you tell us a little bit more about what you learned about where we came from? Were we genetically manipulated?
Well, this is in terms of when someone goes down this road of uncovering truth, and it's interesting, right? People are on one end of the spectrum or the other. And a lot of people don't understand why that is. One person who falls under this illusion of just, watching reality shows and thinking everything's the way it is, and that's that person. And then there's people like you and I and others who, to a lot of people, they seem completely crazy, like insanely crazy if you try to talk to them about this stuff. And what you just said is one of the most taboo sides of this studying, because there's such a stigma and a control of the idea of where we came from and who we are. And I can go down some of the ways that's happened to us. But essentially, we have to have a whole discussion about Darwinism, because that led us into this cave of our own perceptions. And I want to start with that, because then we can go into understanding where we really came from and what this place is. So let's go back a little bit to understand that when the church was becoming powerful after the Roman Empire collapsed, after the Byzantine Empire, it was originally called, collapsed, it morphed and formed into something called the Roman Catholic Christian Church. It was just this retooling of the Roman Empire, because they knew it was an unsustainable model. All empires are unsustainable, by the way, including currently right now. So when the Roman Empire collapsed and the church adopted this these various versions of the Bible and these teachings that are either stolen and rewritten from cuneiform writings, like we're going to go over, or they're taken from places like the Book of Enoch or various places like that, which don't give any credit to. But basically what they realized was that the whole future aspect that they were going to look into achieving was controlling thought and controlling information and controlling how people think. And that's why so many people were burned at the stake if they were considered witches or whatever it was, because they were considered people that thought differently. Like if someone said that they thought that the earth wasn't the center of the universe and that they could, they could perceive or they figured out that there were, planets all revolving around the sun and that we're just simply part of, a great billions of solar systems and galaxies, that person would have been burned at the stake because they're disrupting the model of reality that's being controlled. And that hasn't changed much. People are not burned at the stake anymore, but there's still this very, very, very strong attempt to keep a lid on this information. And we're going to go into the Vatican Archives later, but it all ties into this powerful Christian and Catholic Church Roman Empire that had collapsed. And what they essentially did was there was this scientist named Darwin who visited the Galapagos Islands, and he had a theory that all evolution was based on survival of the fittest and that it had all come from a primordial pool of ooze, and that a tiny little creature could turn into everything from a tiger to a woolly mammoth to whatever it was to eventually a person, right? And that's basically still what our model that's taught in school today is, except if you look into Darwin and you look into what he actually wrote in his papers, he specifically said that he found tremendous flaws in his work and that he called his science simply a placeholder because he knew that in the future it would be disproved and his theories would become just past theories that were eventually realized. The problem was the church really liked Darwin's ideas because it gave us a very skewed point of reality that we're nothing here, right? That we're just an evolved ape and that everything you see around the globe, all the wars and all the conflict is simply a leftover trait of our slow evolutionary process out of the ape world, and that we're still animals. And that's the model that's been used today to explain everything. And that's basically how people think, except there's a big problem with that. It's not true at all. So I used to believe that was real, but there were certain things that didn't make sense to me. And I didn't realize that it wasn't real until I started to really think logically and then dig into some of these cuneiform tablets and to look into some of our ancient history. A lot of people don't understand that if you don't understand ancient history, you will not be able to correctly put the pieces together of things today because they directly correlate to all the things that happened in our past. And so what that means is when you read ancient cuneiform writings from Sumer, our earliest civilization, and right up through the Babylonians and the Assyrians and all the way up through the Egyptians and then the Greeks and all of these, you see these similarities that pop up all over the place. And they basically tell almost the same story. And I want to very strongly point out something I recently talked about before, but one of the problems with these cuneiform writings is that they're very long and a lot of people don't spend the time to actually read them. But more importantly, because they don't actually go to read them, they just take everything as hearsay. And what that means is if someone's able to manipulate them into thinking a certain thing about those writings, they'll just simply take it as face value and believe it. And what happened essentially is this. There have been many people who have translated these ancient cuneiform writings, this is our earliest writings that explain everything. They explain where all the laws came from, agriculture. They explain how our reality became what it is today. And the reason why those are not at the top notch of our educational system and everyone's reading them and understanding them is that, one, we've been made to believe they're a myth. And two, most importantly, the very person who has spent the most time translating them we've been made to believe that he created all of his notion and ideas incorrectly based on what he wanted, and that all of references to what are known as the Anunnaki or the Anuna, they call themselves. Any reference to that, if you were to go online and ask how many people think the Anunnaki are real, I bet you 1 out of every 3 people is going to think that Zecharia Sitchin created that. And this is the point I want to start and clear this whole mess up, because not a lot of people are talking about this right now. In 1849, there was a huge discovery made in Nineveh, Iraq, which is now Iraq. And that used to be the ancient, Assyrian and Babylonian empires. Now, what they found was called the Ashurbanipal Library. And it contained these cuneiform writings that had been amassed by the king there, Ashurbanipal. He traveled all over Mesopotamia and he gathered all of these really rare cuneiform writings and he put them all in this massive library. It is the most important library on Earth, and most people have never heard of it. I did a video on my channel about it to try to help people understand, because this library contained some of the most important versions of all of these texts that we have. In fact, if they didn't find that library, we wouldn't even have them today. Now, and why that's important was that shortly after the discovery was made in 1849, there was a man named George Smith who was an expert Assyriologist. This is way before the cover-up and the suppressing of this information ever occurred. And George Smith translated things like the Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh literally 50 to 70 years before Zecharia Sitchin. And in his translations are found very clearly, if you were to go look up his work. It's called the Chaldea account of Genesis, I think. And in that writing, he translated in the late 1800s all of this information. And what it says is it talks about all of these gods that came to Earth, and they call themselves the Anuna. Now, before anyone thinks the Anunnaki, again, is some word that someone made up, this great god being that they all worship or are basically obsessed with, his name is Anu. And Anu can be seen all throughout the ancient world, basically obsessing about this character Anu. And these beings, part of this empire under Anu, their name just simply derives from his name. So, and this is actually really common. Like in Assyria, they mimic the same thing in Assyria where these empires were, where these libraries were found. Like with the leader there, Ashurbanipal, his name is derived from Ashur, who is the name of the original Sumerian god Enlil. So his name was Ashur when he went up into the Assyrian Empire and started those civilizations. And so as you can see right there, like the name of kings later on just simply derived from his name. And that's how these beings work. They're obsessed with loyalty and honor and this empire mentality. And when you start to reflect on our world and how things have gone, it really starts to make a lot of sense that that's how the model of Earth has gone too. So what do these cuneiform writings say? Well, first of all, the Sumerians are the earliest civilization we have on Earth. They clearly state in their writings, in many, many, many places, that all of the things that they supposedly were the first to develop, they did not develop them. They were given that information. And they all say the same thing. In places like the Sumerian king list, which is one of these cuneiform writings, the very first sentence says, kingship was lowered from heaven. And then it talks about the flood and all the devastation. And then it says, after the flood, kingship was again lowered from heaven, and it was in the city of Kish. And it talks about how we've had these disasters on the earth that have wiped out periods of civilizations, and then they had to be restarted again. And that makes a lot of sense if you start to consider why there's so much advanced technology in places like the Great Pyramid of Giza that we simply just can't understand today, because it's part of these lost civilizations. And that's something I talk about quite a bit. And so these cuneiform writings, to make a long story short, they say that these beings, which are just advanced humanoids, let's make that very clear. They're just advanced humanoids. That's why we do not look like anything else on this earth, because we're not. We are them. People, it's funny, right? Everyone's like, I don't know if I believe in aliens. That's pretty ridiculous. Just go look in the mirror, because we are essentially them. We're essentially a genetically modified, you could call it a Denisovian Neanderthal, early hominid, humanoid that was given their gifts, and we were basically jump started. So what that means is this: if they had never come to Earth, then it would have taken potentially millions of years to get to where we are now, except that's not really how things work. Again, this evolutionary model. So what is evolution? How does it really happen versus what we've been told? And the way I look at it is, I got a lot of these questions can be answered from like really fantastic researchers like Lloyd Pye, who have looked into these early evolutionary sides, and they've realized that there's this whole side of macroevolution versus microevolution. And what that means is a species cannot transform into a different species. That is physically impossible. However, a species can take on different traits as part of their environment to become accustomed to it. As in, let's say some kind of an elephant, woolly mammoth type creature could grow more hair based on being exposed to an environment that's extremely cold over long periods of time. But an animal could not grow an extra ear or some kind of an extra this just doesn't work. And that's how we've been misled down this road of thinking that here's Earth, no one ever visits it, it's isolated, everything is happening here completely on its own, and it's part of this process. When in reality, this is what I've come to the conclusion of. There are sentient beings all over call it the multiverse, because it's no longer a universe. Our understanding is that the universe is actually made up of layers of almost infinite versions of itself. And that's how time itself is basically a completely different concept than we can understand. So basically how it works is sentient civilizations reach a certain point where they develop an expansion and understanding of everything around them, and they visit other worlds and other places, and they end up becoming either stewards of those places, or they become almost like parasites on those places. And that has to do with the mentality of whatever these advanced beings are. And during the research I've done, and if you look into ancient Native American cultures like the Hopi, who, by the way, I think predate any other Native American civilization in the Americas. I believe they're part of a lost beginning that does not derive from the ice bridge in the Bering Strait at all. But anyway, the Hopi talk about how they were connected to the Pleiadians as part of their ancient legacy, and that the Pleiadians were part of the designers of Earth. And what that means is, instead of thinking on an evolutionary pathway that everything came from this sludge and then changed into something else and whatever it was over billions of years, think of it as when a planet is ready, when it's cooled enough to support life, then you see these planners, you could call them galactic planners, could go to a place. You can even call it panspermia, because in some cases, some of this is probably panspermia, and some of it is direct intervention from others. And basically what that means is most cases life did not come from here. It was either arrived here through asteroids and comets and other means, or it was brought here. And the conclusion that I've come to, that the Pleiadian teachings really, like Barbara Marciniak really does a great job talking about this, is that I believe that the Earth is part of this DNA library. So you think of it as every continent, every unique environment has, thousands and millions of different species, whether it's insect all the way up through, birds and animals and all these things we see, they're part of this genetic library on Earth. And we've been systematically, of course, destroying that library over the last several hundred years. In fact, just within the last couple of years, we reached the point where humans are now directly responsible for 50% of all reptile and mammal species on the earth that have disappeared. It's so sad. And a lot of those are tiny and small and we never knew they existed, but we still essentially think about what that means. We are responsible for causing a species that's been here for millions of years to potentially never exist again. And that's a really sad thing to think about. That species will never exist ever again. And it's not because of natural selection. It's simply because of call it a society that is given an incorrect model of their connection to the earth, and that they're stewards rather than just trying to rape and consume all the resources as fast as possible. And that misconception is why we're in the place we're in today, of treating this world the way we do, rather than treating it like this galactic library of species and plants that could be potentially from all over the galaxy. And so we, as humans, we are simply this experiment. We're an experiment in both consciousness, being housed in this third dimensional body, as well as an experiment of being essentially these Anunnaki, you could call them children. We are these Anunnaki laborers, I guess. And that's where I see our truth coming from. But really, anyone who thinks that this is somehow going to make them feel sad or depressed, it's the complete opposite. Because we've been made to believe we're nothing and that we're just apes, when the reality is we are incredible beings that have gifts that have been instilled in our DNA and our genetics from these, you call them gods, these advanced beings, that makes us far more important than we realize. And I want to make one more point before we move on. There are 7 colors in the visible light spectrum. I tell this to people all the time because I feel like I'm a broken record, but I can't not tell people. There are 7 colors in the visible light spectrum. If you look at a rainbow, this is very important. If you're looking at that rainbow from red up to purple, every single one of those colors is going to have an increasingly higher vibration. And what that means is every color in the visible light spectrum goes from red to blue and then purple, from a low vibration to a very high vibration. And in the cover of my book shows this red versus blue world that's in conflict, because it has to do with these competing sides of keeping us either in our lowest state or allowing us to reach our highest state. And this is where it gets amazing. We have 7 chakras in our body. Chris, have you heard of chakras?
Yes, I have.
Okay, good. We have 7 chakras in our body. It represents these points of energy where we can completely fundamentally change. They are points where our vibration can actually change permanently if we do certain things, like reach a certain health state in our physical body and reach a certain state mentally. We can change and move up these chakras. And here's where it gets wild. When you learn that Enki genetically designed us, especially you learn through like the Emerald Tablets when Thoth talks about it, how we are like these light beings with amnesia that don't understand who we really are, it really starts to make sense when you go over this, what we're talking about right now with this visible light spectrum. Because 7 colors of visible light spectrum, each with an increasing vibration. We have 7 chakras in our body, exactly matching the 7 colors of the visible light spectrum in terms of vibration. And what that means is your root chakra, your lowest possible state that you can exist in, it's called your root chakra. It's your red chakra. That's where people are kept if they're in a state of fear and war, about being uneasy, about if you're in a somewhat of a very anxious and very fearsome state. That's where you're going to be kept. And that's the lowest vibration we can exist in, okay? And as you move up to higher and higher up your chakras, your vibration increases and you simply become more and more aware. That's about all it comes down to. We are literally designed around the vibration of the visible light spectrum. That's what we're designed around. That's why we really are like these light beings that really have lost all this knowledge of it, because it's been systematically destroyed. And that's going to be an interesting side we can get into too.
That's amazing. That is awesome. Yes, thank you for that. Now, speaking of these frequencies, I know you were speaking of these interdimensional entities that are not necessarily looking out for us. You could say they maybe seek to lower our frequencies. We might know them as Archons. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Absolutely. This is a fascinating area. And the first place to start would be for anyone that's listening to this to go and look up what's called the Nog Hammadi Scriptures. And what that means is during World War II, or during that time period, there was these buried scriptures that were discovered in Egypt. And inside them, they found all of this very, very important information in these different chapters that have been recorded. And one of the chapters is called The Hypothesis of the Archons. And right there, that's like a really, really scary title, right? That's real, and it actually says that. And these are ancient writings that go back thousands and thousands of years. And it's interesting because Nag Hammadi means basically snake scriptures, snake writings. And when we get back into the mentality and the sides of these two competing families that we're going to talk about, you'll see where the snake fits in and where the eagle fits in. And so in the Nag Hammadi Scriptures, and specifically in the chapter, The Hypothesis of the Archons, it talks all about who the Archons are. And if we can break down the word Archon, it simply means ruler. And so the Hypothesis of the Archons is talking about who are the rulers of our world. And of course, those things were left out of the Bible, right? While other things were put in and rewritten, you have some of our most ancient writings that clearly state who these beings are and what their mentality and direction was. And what he talks about is how long ago, before we had records and that we have now, there were these rulers that took control of Earth, rulers that took control of our reality, actually. And what that means is, getting back to the Sumerian king list, like it said, the first sentence it says before it talks about anything is that kingship was lowered from heaven. Well, what is kingship? It simply means the framework for everything around you, from governing laws and how the mentality of the society is going to go. It is the structure for reality itself. They're the ones who brought down this reality to Earth. That's why the Sumerians say that agriculture, mathematics, and language was all given to them. All of it was given to them because it was just brought to this world. And so who are these rulers? Well, the rulers of our world, in many cases, they're still controlling this world. They've never left, or they've at least their governing has never left. I do think that some of them are gone, but I think it's hard for us to perceive. And let me explain the reason behind that. We exist in the third dimension primarily. Right now, us talking and looking at you, this is the third dimension. However, there are dimensions both below us and dimensions above us. And how it works is this. We can only see a small amount of what's actually in front of our eyes. We can only see what's called the visible light spectrum. And there's far more beyond the visible light spectrum. Like when you and I were talking about before off the show, these probes that were sent out to look for planets and various things, they don't send something that can see out of the visible light spectrum. They have to go infrared because they're looking for completely different things than we can see with our eyes. And that just shows you that there's so much around us that we just simply can't perceive. And that is how an advanced civilization could completely control a lower civilization that they created, because they're simply in higher dimensions. They can play God, essentially, or gods, we would call them. And so that's how this whole thing has worked. These beings came here long, long ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago. They came here because they were looking for essentially resources, and there's a whole story behind it. But we are the product of them realizing that they could not maintain the needs of what they wanted in this planet if they didn't have someone to help them. And so we're an experiment that came out of a need to have both labor and this representative in the third dimension. Because they themselves, in most cases, do not spend any time in the third dimension. As weird and wacky as that sounds, it's difficult for us to understand what that means, because largely we only perceive the third dimension. If you go into deep meditative state, you can ascend to the fourth and fifth dimension, but only for a very temporary period of time, whereas they can actually exist there permanently, and in some cases above that. So it all comes down to an awareness of everything that's around us. So what happens when this third dimensional experimental being wakes up to realize you could call it the farm around them, this control that's been going on for thousands and thousands of years, this competition for how human society would go? That's essentially been what it's gone down, and we can explain how that went to at some point too.
Yeah, sounds great. Wow, that's really fascinating stuff. Now I want to get back to a little bit of the ancient history as far as pyramids. Can you talk about a little bit about the significance of the pyramids, maybe a little bit about their purpose?
Okay. And I didn't even actually answer your last question. I just realized I'm going to tie right into the pyramids. Right. Basically, what you find when you look at the Greek gods, the Roman gods, the Sumerian gods, the Assyrian gods, the Babylon, all throughout history, they all have different names, and also the Mesopotamian gods too. I mean, the Mesoamerican gods as well. They all have these different names, but they all have the same mentality that carries over from them. And what that means is you can trace the influence of these rulers, these archons, because that's all they are. They're just rulers. You can trace these rulers all across history through every civilization by their mentality. And the easiest one to connect to is to look at the Greeks, because you look at these polarizing figures of Poseidon and Zeus, and you quickly learn when you start to connect all the way back that Poseidon is simply this being Enki, and Zeus is simply this being Enlil, and they're this rival family that's been competing all along. Now, they each had sons and daughters that carried down this legacy, and they would almost in every case. There was very few cases where this wasn't the example, but there was crossover of like a son of Enlil would occasionally change mindsets and want to be part of the other side of higher consciousness. But in general, a son of one of these beings would essentially take on the mentality of their father. So Enlil had sons like this son Ninurta, and Enki had sons, like especially this one named Ningshita Thoth. Thoth was his Egyptian name. And they had this huge signature all across our planet of which civilizations have been started by them and which civilizations have either been destroyed or conquered. And so let's connect it back to the pyramids, because if you look into the age of the pyramids, we're told they're about 4,500 years old, and that they're made to house pharaohs. That's what everyone's told. That's what our schools are giving every kid when they go in, and then they have this predetermined view of what history is. But it's again, like we were saying in the beginning of the show, it's all lies. And that can be really disturbing for some people to understand, but just do a little research and you look and you find out that there's never been a pharaoh ever found in the Great Pyramids of Giza, especially the Great Pyramid itself. And so if you say, well, there's no pharaohs found in it, then why are we taught that? Well, because if people found out that there were no pharaohs ever buried or ever intentionally put in the pyramids, they would start asking questions like, well, what's their real purpose and why were they built? Because right now we're told that the pharaohs were placed there and that they built these enormous structures to honor them, and that's completely wrong. And it's a very interesting lie to give us a misdirected view of what their purpose was. But if you look, about 400 miles south of the Great Pyramid of Giza is a place called the Valley of the Kings. And this is where all of the kings of Egypt, most of them, were all buried. They brought them down and they buried them. And you can see right there automatically, and there's no pyramids found there. These were, in a lot of cases, these pharaohs and kings were buried deep underground in these chambers in various places. So they weren't pyramids at all that they were buried in. And so here you have these enormous pyramid structures all over the world, and especially we'll focus in on the ones in Giza. And they have all these strange alignments and all these things to them, and then it has nothing to do with pharaohs. And this is where it essentially gets down to. There are two important what are called air shafts in the Great Pyramid of Giza, and they're called the Queen and King's Chamber. And what that means is we're told those were simply created as air vents for whoever was in there so they could breathe, except that they're exactly positioned in such a precise way that they line up to certain star constellations, but not now. They only line up long ago, far before we were told that the pyramids were built, because there's this thing that our Earth does. It's called the precession of the axis. It changes its position over time based on the stars at a very slight amount. And so when you want to know what the night sky looked like back during supposedly whenever these were built, you would have to figure out where the stars were positioned at that time. And with computers, we can do that today. And you can simply figure out that when the King's Chamber was aligned to the constellation of Orion, and when the Queen's Chamber was aligned to Sirius, when did that happen? Well, it last happened 10,500 years ago, which matches exactly what both Thoth says in the Emerald Tablets, as well as Plato talking about how Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before him. And how does that correlate? Well, Thoth in the Emerald Tablets, these ancient writings that go way back, he wrote about how when Atlantis was destroyed, he traveled to Egypt and he called it the land of Chem. And he says, I built the pyramids. And if you start looking at ice core data and you compare Plato's date of 9,000 years before that existed before him, you nail right on that 10,500 year date. And you start to get a little bit more of a correlation. You say, okay, the pyramids are 10,500 years old. And that means that the Atlantean civilization preceded them, was before them, and that the Sumerian civilizations we see in Mesopotamia, they actually came after. So there's this whole disconnect with this ancient Egyptian civilization that was essentially changed over, and we have the complete incorrect dates for. And you see this connection that goes all the way back to both Atlantis and all the way down to Mesopotamia, to Sumer. All these civilizations, what they were doing was they were being controlled by certain gods, these Anunnaki. And they don't call themselves the Anunnaki, they call themselves the Anuna. And it says that specifically in, like I was saying, George Smith translated the Atrahasis, in the late 1800s, and right in the Atrahasis, one of the most important texts we have. I want everyone to read that. I just did a video on it recently. They talks right in there all about the Anuna and the Anunnaki and about how they genetically manipulated us. It has the entire story. And it even has the deluge story, talking about these disasters that occurred that wiped out a lot of these ancient civilizations. And that's why we see the pyramids having this much older date than we're giving, as well as a place like Göbekli Tepe up in Turkey, which is this emerging site that has been radiocarbon dated to like 11,000 years old, and which completely throws off this model we're given for when human civilizations developed and what our timeline has been. Because the amazing thing right now about this is, if you look at what our books say about 11,000 years ago, what were civilizations doing? All of the critics and the mainstream scientists, and they say we were nomadic and we were traveling around in groups and hunting. Except that here you have Göbekli Tepe, that is this ancient monolithic structure that has connections to the stars, very similar to Stonehenge actually, has connections all through the constellations and this advanced knowledge and all of these things. Why would a nomadic hunter-gatherer society stop and build one of the most fantastic structures we could have ever uncovered, with knowledge that's beyond what we even thought possible, and then deliberately bury it? So that, and that's what they found. There was literally piles and mounds of dirt that had been they can actually determine in such a way if something fills in naturally or if it's actually put in by people doing it. And they determined that Göbekli Tepe was one of these sites that was deliberately buried. What did they know, right? How did this advanced civilization know that a lot of these sites were either going to be disrupted from whatever earth changes are occurring, but also more importantly, they knew that there was, with whoever was given the information, which I think it was probably part of Thoth, but they knew that this information right now that we're talking about and these ancient sites would be deliberately destroyed and also suppressed and hidden. So some of these places, like I said, the Nog Hammadi Scriptures was found buried too, and the Göbekli Tepe was found buried. All these things were buried and sealed off because I think they understood that based on whoever was in charge, that there would be this thousands of year period of when war empires would try to conquer and destroy all of these things. We will never know how many of these ancient sites were completely destroyed and eradicated before the history books and information was ever able to find them. All we have left, from what I've gathered, are just scraps and pieces of what actually used to exist.
Wow. Thank you for that. That's awesome information. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Now, moving even further back, you mentioned Atlantis. Now, would you say this is our first civilization?
It actually looks like places like Atlantis and Lemuria,
yes,
were the first advanced civilizations we probably have, at least that we have any information about. And basically, what I've uncovered is that Lemuria was a subcontinent that used to exist like Atlantis, and Lemuria existed somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, probably near where a lot of the Pacific Islands are, up through the Hawaiian area. And the reason why it's either nothing's there now or everything's moved around is that there have been really, really cataclysmic earth changes that have occurred in such a way where entire land masses have either disappeared and become submerged, or some places have even moved. Some masses have moved because of, the plates of the earth and various changes that have occurred. So when you look into, like Plato talks about in the Timaeus and Critias, when he talks about Atlantis being destroyed 9,000 years before him, he talks about how the destruction was so extensive that there was nothing left. And to fill in more pieces, there's been a lot of other people that have talked about it, but I think the Emerald Tablets is probably the best source of information about Atlantis. And Thoth really, really just has pages where he talks about how Atlantis existed as this subcontinent west of the Pillars of Hercules, and we know that as the Straits of Gibraltar. So it was somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. Atlantis derives from Atlantic, just like Atlas. The Atlas Mountains in Morocco derived from this great king of Atlantis that used to be there. All these names all come from this original place. And at the end of Atlantis, when it was before it was destroyed, there was actually a war that occurred there. And a lot of people are going to know exactly what that is when I mention it. It was the War of the Titans and the Olympians. And that's become this big, it's just a myth right now in our society, except for you find out who these competing sides were. The Titans was essentially Poseidon and Thoth and the side of, call it the higher knowledge side. And then the Olympians was this war side of the eagle under Zeus and Ninurta, which his name in Ninurta's name to the Greeks was Apollo. So you had these two sides that have been competing for all throughout human civilizations, from the Romans and the Greeks and all across our society. They've been competing for how our civilizations would go. Now Enlil, this brother, he always had the symbol of the eagle, or in some cases also the bull. But the eagle was his primary symbol, either the double-headed eagle or the single-headed eagle. And that was his symbolic representation of his mindset and his side of the family. And on the other side, you had Poseidon Enki, which his side was the serpent and the dragon. And that has, you can find traces of that all across the world with these two sides that have been competing all along. And so Atlantis, we had this emerging advanced civilization, not like we think of with flying cars, but with understanding like what the pyramids are found all over the earth on these ley lines, these energy centers. Nikola Tesla talked all about this energy that can be tapped into, this free energy that exists around the earth, that we wouldn't have to be worrying about polluting and ruining our world with fossil fuels if we even understood that this was possible. And of course they do, but there's no money to be made in that. Just like our entire medical industry is based on artificial compounds. That's because it's the primary purpose is, again, making money. And when something is based on money, finding cures and finding things that are solutions are not part of what they find. Because what would be the point? So getting back to Atlantis, there was what was called dark magic that was actually being practiced there by a lot of the people in Atlantis. Okay, because these two competing sides that wanted the Atlantean civilization to go. And these dark sides in the Emerald Tablets, it talks about how they actually contacted and brought in what are called lower dimensional beings. And they actually, it's entirely possible that some of those beings that had been brought in through these very Satanistic, like we see today, these very Satanistic blood sacrifice rituals, they are responsible from, like, why do you think people do them? It's because they are the way to connect to this entire other side. Instead of connecting to higher dimensional beings, that's the way you connect to lower dimensional beings. And that forms a framework of what a lot of the ancient cultures consider this battle of light and dark. And the problem is, a lot of those beings, these Anunnaki, some of them became very corrupted. And I actually think that a lot of these lower dimensional beings may have actually even took them on as to almost parasitic to even control their mindset. So who's using who in the end is only a matter of perspective, because I see very disastrous things like Thoth talks about in the Emerald Tablets that occurred in Atlantis, where a lot of this dark magic was being performed. And what happened was earth changes ended up coinciding with this. And some writings even talk about how they may have, like Enki and others, may have actually deliberately had Atlantis be destroyed because it became this location of extremely unstable use of energy and dark magic. And a lot of people don't even think that magic is real, except that during this huge time of our history, anyone who was considered a witch or a sorcerer or whatever it was being gathered up and burned at the stake. You think all those people were faking it, or just people that thought differently? There was this long lost thing called the old religion that used to exist, that was part of Enochian magic and all these things that were around long ago. There used to be all these things, and they've been lost. It almost doesn't even exist anymore. And so when Atlantis was destroyed, the people of Atlantis that were part of this higher mindset, they all traveled to these certain locations on the planet, like the Basque region of Spain and France, and down through Morocco, and then over to Egypt. And these became some of the most conscious locations on our planet. And so if you're listening to this and you happen to be from the Basque region or Morocco or whatever it is, you have lineage that may tie directly to this ancient Atlantean lineage that goes far back to this time when they essentially escaped their continent that was sinking into the ocean.
Awesome. Great stuff. Thank you for that. Now, earlier you were talking about consciousness and how it has been suppressed over the years through whether it be what we've learned in our history or different types of methods. Can you talk a little bit about that and how maybe we can tap into some of that consciousness that we've lost?
So when you look into, we just celebrated St. Patrick's Day. Okay, this is a great thing to bring up. And people are going to be like, what does this have to do with consciousness? Well, St. Patrick's Day, we're told, is being celebrated because St. Patrick ridded all the snakes from Ireland. And then, you know, there's this whole aspect of Irish pride that's present there. And people drink and they wear green and all these things. And it's a complete joke because St. Patrick's Day, in my mind, is the most sinister of all the holidays that we celebrate. And again, what does that do with consciousness? Well, St. Patrick was being pushed by the church, or he had been tasked by the church to rid the snakes from Ireland. And a lot of people see that and they're like, that makes sense. There was a bunch of really dangerous poisonous snakes in Ireland and they were going to attack everybody. But if you just do a little research, you'll find out that there were no snakes in Ireland that have ever been there. It's way too far north. They can't survive there. So if it's not snakes, then what is it? Well, there's this whole side of understanding both ancient cuneiform writings all the way up to holidays that has to do with this metaphorical, symbolic aspect of how they reference things. And what that means, the snakes, like we're going to get back to snakes, goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden story on how there's this divide between the evil snake that gave the knowledge of good and evil, consciousness, to Adam and Eve, which is a very real story. Adam's name was Adamu. This talks about the early creation story of this genetic manipulation of the early hominid, and how Enki the snake had given Adamu the knowledge of good and evil consciousness, and how, you know, this God figure was trying to be the good guy, and we should know about that, and he's protecting us, where it's actually a control thing where they wanted, that side, which is Enlil, by the way, Jehovah, Yahweh, wanted to keep us in this lower conscious mentality because it was a much easier way to maintain and control essentially the workers of Earth, like, or the lower people or whatever. He called us beasts, actually, because he knew Enlil was part of this entire process. If you read the Atrahasis, it talks extensively about this, where they needed to take this hominid and change him over to give them the gifts that they have, but Enki ended up giving us too many gifts, and we became too conscious, and gave us all the gift of language. And this whole story has to do with this anger by Enlil that he didn't want us to ever have higher consciousness. He didn't want us to ever have language and understand anything around us, because it's so problematic if that happens, because then you can have your labor force and your domain, you know, these can wake up and realize what they're part of. And so, getting all the way back, the snake and the dragon have always represented Enki's side in knowledge, always. That's why the ancient Chinese and these Asian cultures in India still worship the snake as part of this higher conscious side. But I got to point out before we go into the other conscious side is that in Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and the Mayans were not corrupted by blood sacrifice because of the snake. This is one of the biggest misconceptions that makes it so that the snake is considered the polarized evil figure. When you actually look at the information, like I was just in Chichen Itza last year, and I was looking for evidence of this battle of the eagle and the serpent, because it's all over the world on flags and crests and ancient writings and in rock carvings, and it's all over the world of this struggle where the eagle essentially won and destroyed the serpent all over Earth, the people that had this serpent knowledge. And so what I found in Chichen Itza that was absolutely fascinating was over near the Temple of the Jaguar. And again, I'm sure experts that are all, you know, controlled by the elites that can't talk about this stuff, I'm sure they know about all this stuff already. But people like me that have nothing hitched and nothing attached to me, I can say what I want. So when I'm down there, I was looking for evidence of this, because I know that Chichen Itza was this really good example of the Mayan civilization that eventually became corrupted by war and blood sacrifice. And so is there a record of that? Because they kept track of everything in their stories. That's the whole point of these murals, and they told a story. So I'm looking around in the Temple of the Jaguar, And I have pictures of this on a lot of my, some of the videos I have and some various things I've done, where I found near the Temple of Jaguar, it shows Kukulkan, which was Thoth, the snake. It shows his symbols all over the place, you know, and how he brought the Mayans to higher consciousness and all these things. And then there's this other figure that I don't think anyone has ever seen. There's an eagle also. And this eagle is present, and it's eating a pine cone with the snakes all surrounding it. And if you look into what a pine cone represented, even to these Anunnaki, you can see so many representations of where they're holding a pine cone and they're passing it to mankind or whatever. And what that means is the pine cone represented knowledge or imparting knowledge into another society. Essentially, that's what it came down to. And here you have in Chichen Itza, you have this story about how the Mayans used to be perfectly connected to the stars and understanding all of these things around them. And then all of a sudden it became warlike and they started doing all these blood sacrifices, just like the Aztecs. And lo and behold, here you have this story that's being told in rock. It's saying that here we had Kukulkan Thoth give them lightning and then move on. Because where did he go? Well, he had to establish the Mayans, right? And then where did he go? He went down the Aztec, and then he went all the way down. Well, it's a lot of questions about when the Inca was actually founded, but he essentially was part of founding all of those cultures, or parts of people that were associated with him. And so when he left the Mayans and he had to travel to the Aztec to then set up their societies, he left and he was gone. And the Mayans became desperate, and they had another god who pretended to play as Kukulkan who came over. And that was part of this eagle side. And it was either Ninurta or someone associated with the Enlil side. And they corrupted the Mayans and then the Aztec to believe that if they wanted to bring their gods back, they could sacrifice their blood, and they would bring these gods back that had given them knowledge. But it was a complete trick, because it actually, number one, it brought in these lower dimensional beings, remember, like we said, through these practices, and it corrupted the entire culture. And it led to, besides when they were then, like the Aztecs were then conquered by Cortez. But if these things had never occurred with this, with going in and then completely corrupting the civilization, they would have never have had the downfall like they had. So what does that mean? It means that there's been this ancient war. And this is one of the things that I'm writing about extensively in my next book. I call my next book The Stage of Time, because the Earth is part of this stage of both the higher and lower dimensions on how things are going to play out in this physical reality. And so there's been this struggle of both these two sides of this ancient family about how civilizations will go, right? Either this higher conscious mentality side that connects back to the stars, or a war mentality. So let's go all the way back to where we started. I didn't forget. Back to St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick was ridding all of the snakes from Ireland. And why that's such a sad thing is that if you actually look into who the snakes were, they were simply druids and pagans. And that meant any of these old religions, like we talked about, before it became part of the control mechanism, where they were in tune with, just like the Mayans were, tuned with the stars and in tune with the harmony of the earth, and understanding this entire other aspect of our consciousness, this higher aspect of our consciousness, okay? And they were essentially eradicated all over Earth. A lot of these crusades were both part of finding ancient relics and cleansing and the land of these leftover people that could connect all the way back to this ancient snake knowledge. So the Druids were the ones who were the ancient Druids were the ones who built Stonehenge. And the reason why that's such a sad thing about St. Patrick's Day is that Ireland and Scotland and Wales, that whole area, was the last refuge on the entire planet of these Druids that connected all the way back. And they were that holiday represents their eradication on Earth, and that they were completely eradicated. We don't even know how many were actually killed. I've heard numbers in the thousands, and I've heard hundreds. I don't know. We don't know exactly how many were killed. Some fled, and then others were just simply killed. But that's what St. Patrick's was tasked with, And when he did that, it allowed the complete control of essentially the whole planet by these empires of the church. And you only had these small segments that survived, like Buddhism and Hinduism, in places that had still had these ancient roots back to the snake. And that's why they're the only religious cultures, or some of the only religious cultures we see on Earth, that have to do with a higher consciousness rather than this given version of reality and what we should believe and what we should think and that we see now. That's how we've had this real, very sinister, systematic control of how consciousness will be viewed. And it hasn't really changed. It's been going on for a long, long, long time. It's just that it became such a way where we literally lost all knowledge of these things. You talk to most people and they have no idea the truth of St. Patrick. They don't know anything about the age of the pyramids. That's because these things have been very carefully suppressed so that we don't find out the truth. And for people like you and I who are like stumbling upon this, we're really dangerous because we're disrupting this whole model of reality. So what they do is they keep all of these distractions, these illusions. That's why they called my last book The Illusion of Us. They keep all these illusions and distractions going so that people either A, never have time because they're just working all the time, or B, they're spending their free time just entertaining themselves. And they're not spending their time looking into all these things because really, how does someone know they don't know something if they don't know it? That's a really difficult place to figure out. Someone can't be like, I might be missing a ton of ancient history, but I'm just going to choose to ignore it. There are people that are like that, but most people, when they're coming across this information, because all of it's lumped in this giant category called conspiracy, anything that falls into a conspiracy, doesn't matter if it's geoengineering chemtrails or all the way to ancient history, they're all part of these ways where we're being misled about the truth. And those are all conspiracies. Isn't it amazing that something like the JFK assassination is almost like believed and understood now that something the government was involved with? Look at all the papers that just got released, and they were like, we're going to release all the JFK papers. Actually, we're going to keep like 50 of them. And then we might release them. Actually, we're not going to. Right? Why wouldn't you release something like that unless it had information that would make the story look different? And how that went is simply the CIA was extremely worried that JFK was going to take down the banking system and the CIA and the wars that were going on. They had to take them out. And so the point I'm trying to make is most people acknowledge that the government had a hand in his death. And that's a conspiracy. And yet any other conspiracies that come down the line are immediately rejected because we have this very delicate subconscious view of hold of reality. If you were to wake up in the morning and you wake up in the morning and you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to go to work and I'm going to come home and watch a movie. And I feel like I know like the way things work because I went to college and I understand all these things. You're going to feel this sense of calm because you feel like you understand reality, right? Anyone who's intelligent is going to need this sense of understanding things around them. Now, and the reason why that's important is because whenever you bring conflicting information to someone, something that comes along that completely disrupts that entire view of reality, it's so difficult to incorporate it because of how many people are telling us this is the way it is, that they'll reject it. And that's based on the fact that any of these things that go into that category, if they make a lot of people feel that way without the right information at the right time, they'll reject it, instantly reject it, because it's a very, very difficult thing to say to yourself, I've been lied to and I need to try to figure out what actually is true. Because so many of these things are not happy. They're pretty dark, the ways that they've done this and the means that they've done throughout history. And a lot of people, it's very difficult to even look into this stuff because it's really hard to wrap our heads around why elites would all meet at a place like Bohemian Grove in California and do these satanistic every year, presidents and business leaders from all over the world that are part of this tight-knit group of what's called the Illuminati. They all, and of course, we've been made to believe it's a joke. And yet, all these leaders every year, and the atomic bomb was first, signed over, and the plans were first looked at Bohemian Grove. It's this strange place in California where leaders all over the world have these mock sacrifice rituals to this giant owl called Moloch. Okay. And that's right there in the open if you want to go look it online. Just do a little search for it and actually look that this place exists, and that every president from, Bush, I don't even know if Obama went there, but almost every president has gone there. And there were actually, I think Reagan actually wrote, no, it was Nixon. Nixon actually was the only president that for some reason couldn't keep his mouth shut about that place. And he made a comment about how they're so wacky and perverted. It's very interesting. Look up the quote that Nixon said about Bohemian Grove. But anyway, that's a conspiracy, and that's a really dark, strange area. How do you explain leaders from all over the world taking part in a mock sacrifice in front of a giant fire with this huge owl in the back? How do you try to take the version that we've been given and try to make that make sense? You know what I mean? So to make a long story short on consciousness, we are incredible beings that have this potential to reach extremely high levels of consciousness. And if we just believe in ourselves and objectively seek the ways to do that by becoming healthy with our bodies and not allowing all these terrible toxins and things that were pushed on us to happen, and then changing our mindset, spending time outdoors and reading about objective things in ancient history, and start to put the pieces together and what's actually happened, our ascension of our consciousness can occur quite rapidly, actually. Because I feel like we've been held back for so long that I think our bodies and minds are waiting for us to just catch up.
Definitely. And would you say any type of meditation would help with that as well? Absolutely.
Our mind is so cluttered with so much stuff that we need to quiet it to then begin to start anew. We can't just sit down with all the things that are going through our brain and be able to put all these things together in a way that makes sense until we can take our brain and just calm it down a little bit. Calm ourselves. See, putting yourself in that state makes it so that you essentially separate yourself from your physical body. That's the entire purpose of meditating. You're taking yourself out of this reality of this physical world with all the things that are bombarding us. And you completely put yourself in a state where you exist as just your higher consciousness. That's why meditation is literally going into a higher dimension. That's what you're doing. You are mastering the ability for yourself to reach a higher state. And from whether it's meditation or psychedelics or whatever it is, or spending time in the outdoors, whatever it is that people need to do to free their mind, every individual is different.
Thank you, Deb. This is awesome information. I really appreciate this. Now let's get into something that I find really fascinating as well. Nibiru, the whole Planet X. Is it the home of the Anunnaki, and is it really come around this certain amount of time, either 36,000 years or 3,600 years, or whenever it comes? Tell us a little bit about what you know about that.
Okay. This is a really polarizing topic too. It's pretty much up there with the genetic manipulation, I think. All the ancient text, all the ancient cuneiform writings. Remember, kingship lowered from heaven. Well, what is heaven? It's just anything beyond earth. That's it. That's as simple as it gets. Anywhere in the Bible that's referencing heaven and these angels or demons, they're just talking about these beings. Every single archangel and angel, they're just referencing whatever these certain Anunnaki beings are and whatever their mentality was. And so what they all say is they talk about how they came from somewhere else. And they came here specifically because their world, their planet, was being disrupted. Now, why is it being disrupted? Well, if you read back, and there's a lot of cuneiform writings, some that aren't even named. I mean, there's I think more than 50% of all, remember this, more than 50% of all cuneiform writings we've ever uncovered are still untranslated. Isn't that scary to think about? Like you should think to yourself, if you were an objective scientist, that this is the most important writings we have, because they represent the beginning point, the very first stage when we were given this information. Because as you know, if you play telephone with a bunch of kids and you tell someone something, and then it goes all the way around that group, by the time it gets back, it's something completely different than when it started. But what about the person that it was told to? That person still has the original message, right? That's how these cuneiform writings work. They are our earliest records before anything was polluted. And oh yeah, so they go back to talking about, where these beings came from. This Nibiru, and it's spelled differently in a lot of different places. It's not always Nibiru. There's certain different ways that they spell it, but it all comes down, and it's also called Marduk too. There's a tablet called the Enuma Elish. It's very important because it talks about the early creation story of both us, along like the Atrahasis talks about, but it also talks about the creation story of what occurred in our solar system, literally billions of years ago. And what these Anunnaki say, of course, how would they know, right? Well, these beings, according to a lot of the information that I've come across, they're potentially not even from our universe. Try to wrap your head around that. Some of these beings are millions of years old. And of course, with our lifespans capped at 120 years old or so, we can't even wrap our heads around how a being could be around that long, except for the fact that we see so many examples in movies and things where there's this something's done where consciousness is transferred over to another person, right? Stargate did that really, really well. And I think Stargate has a lot of truth in it. And it's essentially what they talked about, how long ago these advanced beings from wherever they came from became trapped in our solar system, in our universe. Like I said, our universe is actually a multiverse, and it represents slices of different versions. And these beings came from somewhere else, okay? And specifically, whatever the means that occurred long ago, whether it was weapons, some kind of advanced war, or them manipulating and trying to play around with the rotations of their planets, because these beings had technology we can't even fathom, okay? Whatever occurred, their solar system, that became our binary. It became trapped in our solar system because their sun is a dwarf sun. It's what that means is this. And that makes sense if you start to think about it, right? A sun only takes on that white dwarf or dwarf signature when it starts to burn out. As a sun becomes really old, a star, they will essentially start burning out the fusion, the energy they have eventually. They'll slowly start to burn out, and they'll shrink and get smaller and smaller. And so what that tells you is that our binary, yes, it's a binary, is part of two completely different aged solar systems that became entrapped in each other, okay? Through very subtle means of gravity because of how big our sun is. So billions of years ago in the Enuma Elish, it talks about how these Anunnaki gods, they named themselves after the planets of both our solar system as well as their planet. And they didn't call, in the Enuma Elish, they didn't call it Nibiru. They called it Marduk, because Marduk was determined to be the head of the gods at the time. And he was the firstborn son of Enki. And so Marduk became this great hero. Now, what did that mean? Well, think about long ago, if this had actually occurred, which it really looks like it did. It becomes trapped in our solar system. And the first, whatever several passes that it occurred, essentially this planet on this giant elliptical orbit, because it doesn't belong here again, would come swinging through a certain part of our solar system, somewhere between Mars and Jupiter. And it essentially crashed into, or one of its satellites, which means a moon, crashed into the planet that used to be there called Tiamat, okay? And that was the proto-Earth, Earth before it became what it is now. And one of the reasons why Earth has so much water is that when Tiamat was destroyed, this is what it says. According to the New Milish, it talks all about this. I encourage everyone to read it. It says essentially that much of the planet was broken apart, and that these enormous holes were then filled in with water over time, because Tiamat was a much larger planet than Earth was. And the remnants of Tiamat became our asteroid field. And so some people were like, I don't believe that. Well, go look at a model of our solar system today, and you'll see that between Jupiter and Mars, you have this giant asteroid belt. Where did it come from? Well, the Enuma Elish clearly states that it was from this ancient collision long ago that left this state of our world the way it is today, and that it caused great destruction in our solar system. And so this planet and these beings, because of that giant elliptical orbit, their planet, their atmosphere started to get destroyed, and they had to come here because of gold. And it seems silly, except for the fact, if you look at it today, gold is the most important resource pretty much on our planet. And the really interesting thing, if you want to get down the rabbit hole, is that a family like the Rothschilds, who essentially controls all the elites, they're like the puppets, I guess you could call it, of these war Anunnaki. Here, they're the representatives. They still determine the daily price of gold, and they have gold mines all over the planet, because gold has these properties. It has nothing to do with being pretty or rare. It has these very important properties because of what the element is, where the reason why astronauts wear it on their visor and why it's all over computer technology and all these things is that it has the highest reflectivity of incoming radiation, solar radiation, of any element that exists. So that means that if you needed a way to reflect solar radiation back, you could essentially use that. Or it has all these other molecular things too, like it may be responsible for actually extending a life form. And when you find these ancient tombs in Egypt, where they have like boxes underneath where the pharaohs were buried with what's called monoatomic gold down into its like a powder form. Why would they have that? Unless it was one of these very sacred things that only these high up kings and various individuals knew. And so there's these various reasons why they came here. But it's essentially, it comes down to the fact that this planet has an enormous elliptical orbit, and these beings come back every time there's a pass that goes near Earth. They come back to gather all of the resources that have been accumulated during that several thousand-year period of us getting it. Because what happens? We are part of these. We buy gold and jewelry, and then we die because we have short lifespans, and then it always finds its way back somewhere, and it's melted down, right? Gold never disappears. It's eternal. So all these things, like pawn shops everywhere, where does all that stuff go? Does anyone ever think about the fact that there's pawn shops on like every corner, and they're all buying gold and silver that's being then sold back to the government, whatever it is? But where is all that going? Into these vaults of bullion and all these things that are actually being considered our currency. So it's a really fascinating aspect if you learn about gold and the properties of why that's so important in today. And so again, does this planet exist? Well, let's get into it. In the 1980s, NASA and other scientists had determined that there was a planet that has to exist somewhere far beyond Pluto, because the evidence for what it's doing spoke louder than any writings or anything that could tell it that exists, as in our two outermost planets, Uranus and Neptune. Scientists found, and actually our entire solar system, but especially those two outer planets, had this very slight tilt to both of their orbits of their planets, this gravitational tilt on an axis. And Uranus and Neptune were both like that. And the only way that's possible, if you get a tilt, is if you get something that's influencing it, some kind of gravitational influence from far away. And was the proof behind them saying planet 10 or planet X exists. If anyone remembers, in the 80s and into the early 90s, there was article after article where they were talking about how it was going to be found any day, and they were just waiting on all these things. So what they did essentially is they sent out infrared probes to go find it in the 80s. And in 1983, they found it. Okay, they found the heat signature for it, and they also found this small binary sun that was also with it. And the proof behind it was there was an encyclopedia that was essentially printed this entire page that described it. And that encyclopedia, and I really want everyone to look at what I'm talking about right now, but that encyclopedia was printed in 1987. And the reason it was allowed to come out was that there was this general acceptance by the majority of NASA and others that they were going to release this information. Except there was a decision then made to not release it. Whether or not it's because, it connects back to the Anunnaki or whatever it is, Earth changes and freaking people out. A number of reasons why they did that. But it was decided to not tell anyone and just bury the whole thing. And it all starts with the head of the Naval Observatory named Robert Harrington. He's the head of the entire Naval Observatory. Remember that, not just some low-life guy with a telescope. He's the head of the entire Naval Observatory, and he's tasked with being part of finding this planet. Okay, and when they got those findings back from this IRIS telescope, he went to the southernmost point of our hemisphere of our Earth to see it. And why can't anyone see it? Well, this planet exists only at an extreme southern elliptical, the elliptical of our planet. You cannot, if you think of space as being 3D, it's not a 2D thing. There's space above us, to the left, to the right, behind us, underneath us. It's a 3D thing. So something is coming from underneath you. You can't see it because your entire planet is facing the wrong way. That's what they determined is happening with this planet. Is it's coming from it's called our southern ecliptic. So he went to the edge of Birch Point in New Zealand, and he had a telescope, and he found it because he knew exactly where to look based on the observations that were coming from this IRIS probe. And so, just like the movie The Deep Impact, he rushes back, right? He rushes back to get all this information out, and before he can publish it, because it takes a long time to get these findings and publish it, as he's in the process of publishing it, he just mysteriously dies of throat cancer.
Right.
Boom, he's dead. And all of his work is then debunked as mathematical error because of Uranus and Neptune being tilted, and the entire thing disappears. And and everybody ignores and forgets it ever existed. Except before they were going to do that, in 1987, the New Illustrated Science and Invention Encyclopedia Volume 18 came out. It's like someone didn't get the memo, right? Because they thought it was going to be released. And on page 2488, it states, Pioneer 10 became the first craft, one of these IRIS probes, to pass into interstellar space in 1983. It says the diagram shows the path of the two Pioneer probes. Now, Chris, can I share an image of this really quick?
Yeah, of course.
So I'm going to share an image of what this Pioneer probe found, because it's absolutely fascinating. Okay. Okay, tell me when you can see that.
Yep, I got it.
So this is the actual page from the 1987 encyclopedia before they decided to cover this whole thing up. And what it shows is absolutely fascinating because it shows two Pioneer probes on the left side being sent out, Pioneer 11 and Pioneer 10. And Pioneer 11 went the wrong way and it didn't find anything, but Pioneer 10 did. And it shows very clearly that according to their calculations from these probes, which are very accurate, they discovered a 10th planet at 4.7 billion miles from Earth. Just think about how far that is. That's why this thing it's so far out, but yet it still can have an impact because gravity can travel immense distances. The larger the mass is, the more it can affect other smaller masses around it. Now, the other thing that it found is absolutely amazing because there's not a lot of information that talks about a binary star. If you do any research into solar systems, you find out that around 80% of all solar systems are binary, meaning they have two suns. So it's extremely common. And here, just like commonality, we find that the Pioneer 10, not only did they find a 10th planet at 4.7 billion miles out, but they found a dead star. And what is a dead star? It's just a dwarf star. It's an old star. And if you think about how this solar system, it's talked about how in these ancient writings that it came long ago, it became trapped, it had different age. It would make total sense that they would report to being this dead star, a much older star. And it's found at 50 billion miles away. So look at where the 10th planet is and look at where the star is. You see this dance of this old dwarf star in our sun that had this enormous orbit. I think I've seen some calculations that this star could be so far out that it doesn't even pass even somewhat nearby for something like, well over like 50,000 years or something. It's just got this enormous elliptical orbit. And so that's why this planet, every time it swings through, causes these potential impacts on us. So in the end, there's a lot that's being hidden from us, a lot that exists out there. And it all comes down to what we're willing to spend our time doing to investigate, to find the truth, versus what we just decide to believe. Because when you do go down this road, it's always a higher conscious road, and it fundamentally changes your life. It's what's called becoming awake. And I can tell you that I try to never push this information on people that aren't ready. For anyone that wants to try to run down the streets and yell this information if they hadn't heard it yet, it all has to do with each person is ready for information at a different time, and every individual is going through a different path and a different stage along that path. But like the Mayans said, we have reached what's called universal consciousness, where people have reached a conscious level where they're ready, and the truth is starting to boil over. And it's starting to really make inroads. If things like YouTube and Facebook and the internet and all these means, if they don't become completely controlled and have the information like the very scary road we're going down right now, where freedom of speech and having this open, objective information there's a serious attempt right now to have that be stopped.
Yeah, I can tell. I can see the major censorship going on. I feel that myself. Now, going back to some of these controllers, and we're basically, you could say they're slaves. These modern day secret societies, would you say these elites, some of their bloodlines tie back to these ancient beings?
That's right. It's one of the most telling areas to look at. Right now, what's going on? We have this world where most of it has become more modernized out of kingdoms, where now we have this democracy platform and these various other platforms that are similar to it. But at the same time, there's this really bizarre thing where in the United Kingdom, we still have this like monarchy with kings and queens, right? Isn't it so strange? All this, ridiculous distraction stuff talking about this big wedding coming up and how Meghan is not part of these royal bloodlines, and the queen and all these others that are really upset because it's not the way things have been done. And why would they care about that, right? Why? Well, if you do a little research into these royals, you'll find that families like the Rothschilds and these royal families, they have bloodlines that can be traced all the way back to the Sumerians, traced all the way back to these ancient bloodline kings. And the way they feel, and the reason why that the things are done the way they are, is that they feel that their blood that makes them who they are makes them superior over everyone else, because there are different bloodlines on this planet. And they're part of an old ancient bloodline, and they will protect that at any cost. They will intermarry. They'll do anything that it doesn't matter. It's protecting the bloodline is the highest priority for them. Now, where did they get that from? That's exactly how the Anunnaki govern their mentality of their royals. They are obsessed with bloodlines. When Atrahasis, the character of Noah that people think is a joke, when he survived, which he did, the only reason Enlil didn't just kill him, because he was one of the last humans on Earth. That's an absolute, read the Atrahasis. It says it clear as day in there. One of the only reasons why he didn't do that was because he found out that that Atrahasis Noah, Zayasudra was one of his names too, was one of Enki's sons. What does that mean then? It means he has royal blood. That's the whole thing behind this, is that these elites have royal bloodlines that they're still maintaining. And they're still maintaining, right? They have that monarchy kingship in the UK. And yet there's this illusion of all countries all over the world that have all their own governing and all their own laws, whereas these elites actually control basically the whole world almost. And because they control the financing systems. The central bank is directly owned privately by the Rothschild family. The Federal Reserve is a privately owned bank by the Rothschild family. The United States has no means to say anything about what it wants to do with its own finances in terms of big decisions. It's like basically just a puppet of these central banks. Now, what countries are not under the central banks? How about Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and all these countries that are being targeted to be, under propaganda and all these things? Really, nothing has changed. It's a combination of keeping war going and destroying these ancient artifacts, because that's where our most ancient civilizations were. And it's about this old ancient mentality that's been going on all along, from the Romans to all the way back to the great Assyrian empires. It's not much has changed. It's their reflection here on Earth, basically.
Yeah, and another aspect I find kind of bizarre and fascinating is the Vatican's role. It seems like they suppress so much information and play such a key role in what's going on. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay, well let's end with that tonight. The Vatican is a fascinating aspect. It's one of these areas that all someone has to do is do a little search on it, and they're going to get their mind blown, because we have these, you could call them control points on Earth. The United Kingdom, and through these monarchy kingship families, they're the governing of the planet. Think of them as the representations of the governing structure. That's why the Rothschild family makes all the decisions. Whereas the religious center of the planet is in Rome. It is the Vatican. And when the conquerors of the Spanish Eagle, of the powerful Catholic Church, when they came over and conquered the Americas, especially the Aztec, they stole immense amounts of relics and ancient writings that they had created, and they basically stored them all underneath there. And that's not even the beginning of it. The Vatican Archives also contains huge amounts of cuneiform writings from Mesopotamia. It contains writings from all over the world. It contains all of these, and it's stuff that we haven't even seen. We're talking about information and relics that should be in a museum, should be something that we'd be studying, but it's in a vault underground in this giant Vatican archive that is being controlled by the church, because it's a way to hold on and to control information. So they simply capture whatever information they don't want people to see, and they keep it locked away. And maybe they release some of it at certain time periods and then act like they're a hero. But more importantly, they keep it all down there, and they keep it locked away, because anything that's down there is part of something that doesn't agree with what's being told above. That's all it is. And so it's about keeping this version of what our reality is. And so the Vatican Archives is one of these places where, in the future, when that whole thing gets exposed and we get access to it, it's just going to blow this entire thing wide open for all that has been held back and all that's been stolen from us, and the fact that we deserve all this information because it's part of our history.
Right. Awesome. Well, I want to thank you for coming on. That was amazing information. Great stuff. Go ahead and end by telling us about a little bit what you got going on. I hear that you're working on another book right now. Is that true?
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel at Mathieu LaCroix where I try to create movies and little documentaries, because I know not everybody loves to read.
Yeah, I'm going to leave the links to that in the description.
Yeah, thank you. And it has the means for someone to learn a lot of this if they don't want to read. So, I mean, I want to provide both, but at the same time, I am a writer, and I guess I've been spending a lot of my time making videos over the last year. I wrote my first book 2 years ago, but it took me until about a year ago to revise it to the point where I'm really happy about it. It's the second edition of The Illusion of Us. But after that point, I became pretty focused on making videos on my YouTube channel. But I'm now at the point where I'm trying to slow down a little bit. And I'm spending every day, I'm writing this next book because I really want to get this done. Because I think it has a lot of really good follow-up information for my first one. Much deeper book. And I'm going to eventually, coming up, I'm going to be looking maybe for an artist for the cover and the various things. I want to go down a little bit more of a professional approach to this because I want this information to be taken seriously. And I want this next one to help bridge the gap between a lot of this information. And then, so the next book is going to be called The Stage of Time. And it's going to focus both on Earth and what it's part of and the importance of what it is all throughout history. But more importantly, it's going to focus on also this war of the eagle and the serpent that's gone on all over Earth and how they've been trying to control certain civilizations all along. And then get into the fact that what's the whole point of it is to control timelines and explain what timelines are and how small things, even like our conversation, can literally change the entire timeline because it's like the butterfly effect of our actions in the way we speak. If you were to go give someone some information that they didn't know about, how do you know how that's going to change their life going forward? They might completely change what they would have done. And so that's how timelines work. And they're very precise and they have to do with very small amounts of information at certain times can have huge actions for the future. So I want to end on one thing I know you want to know about. We're at a time where a lot of this information is people like me who are not part of the mainstream are trying to come forward to bring all this information to try to show all that's been hidden. Okay. And also we have tremendous earth changes that are occurring on Earth changes that are occurring right now with volcanoes and tectonic movements and earthquakes. And that's part of this very interesting cycle that is occurring that probably has to do with solar minimums and this effects of this planet that is going through. And I just want to point out that this road that we're going down over the next call it 8 years until we reach this zodiacal house of Aquarius, this is going to be a very bumpy road. And it's not like learning this information doesn't matter. This is a very important part of our path forward because if we can uncover all of this, we can stop the direction it's headed. We can basically illuminate all of those who are these rulers and all of these means that are holding us back, and we can forge our own timeline. We can go the path that a lot of these potential sentient civilizations have want us to go. Because really, the overwhelming outcome of advanced civilizations is usually higher consciousness, not war and control. Empires almost always collapse.
Well, thank you. That was a great note to end on. Appreciate that. Well, I thank you again for coming on. I definitely want to have you back on sometime soon, and I'm going to be looking forward to that book. Definitely let us know, when we should be looking for it. But,
I will. Thank you so much for having me on, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Anytime. We look to having you back. So thanks again.
All right, thanks. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.